Hi folks, so I'm hoping by now you have had access to our very first module and you've been taking a look at the video that I put up there introducing myself, as well as the readings assigned for this week. So we are going to read Beverly Daniel Tatum's Defining Racism and Omi and Winans' Racial Formation Theory. So in this mini lecture, I'm not necessarily directly unpacking those two essays as yet. I'm just going to give you a glimpse of what our class will focus on and in many ways get us all on the same page. Again, as always, feel free to email me requesting for one-on-one Zooms. I would love to chat with you. And as mentioned before, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity fulfills GE requirements both for the Sociology major as well as the Social Justice major. And in fact, we are working towards creating an Ethnic Studies program, and this class will be one of the foundational classes for that major as well. In this course, we are focusing on the US context. So in many ways, that requires looking at our long racial history. And even before we start doing that, we have to understand that these are not simply sociological questions, but also very personal questions, especially in this current moment when we are in a moment of racial uprising. And if we start our conversation by thinking about our own racial identity, the first step would be to think of our own racial identity and think of that first moment when we had some kind of conceptualization of which particular racial group we belong to. So take a moment and think about that. It could have been a particular comment some classmate made in the schoolyard, or something someone said about the lunch you brought. It could have been on the soccer field. It could have been something you saw on TV. So when you think of the major racial groups in the United States, folks will often list Black, White, Latinx, Asian American, Native American or Indigenous, almost always as an afterthought, because that remains the most invisible group. And then some folks more recently might add other groups like Muslim Americans and so on. Sometimes we club together Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. But as you start looking at this classification deeper, you start seeing that it can be very arbitrary and also very context specific. So while India is smack in the middle of Asia, in the US, I wouldn't be seen as Asian American because we use that label to look at primarily East Asians, right? On the other hand, if I were in the UK, I would definitely be seen as Asian, right? So again, it varies a lot from one place to another, from one period of time to another. So if you look at the timeline in the US and you start thinking about, well, when do we first see mentions of the word race? And we do see the ancient Chinese, Greeks, Romans talk about race, but not associated with phenotype or skin color as we do today. Right? So when you're thinking about racial identity, we have a tendency to think about physiological traits such as skin color, hair texture, eye shape, nose shape, and so on. But this is a modern idea. So that's the first thing to wrap our heads around, that race associated with biology is a very modern idea. It didn't always exist. In the US context, some folks have put forth biblical explanations more in the 17th century and then in the 18th as a way of justifying enslavement. And then later on, we see that throughout the 19th century, it's kind of debated how we classify folks into different racial groups. You had the Dred Scott decision that was given in 1857, which said that essentially black folks, even if they had been in so-called free states, didn't have the right to petition for their freedom. And finally, after Civil War, we see the Emancipation Proclamation leading to abolition in 1865. Now, what's remarkable is that when you survey young folks today, including African American young folks, people will often get the date of the Emancipation Proclamation wrong by 100 years, right? There's a tendency to think of enslavement, but also racism, as something that happened in the far distant past. And it's really important to remember that it wasn't so long ago. You get to our great-grandparents' generation, and you are talking about human beings that were property. So there are some key decisions. 1896, we see segregation being institutionalized with separate but equal. And then the whole era of scientific racism that we look at, the whole debate between polygenesis and monogenesis, where so-called scientists were claiming that black folks were a different species. You have eugenics, where we were talking about pseudoscience backing racial purity. And then on to social Darwinism, talking about superior versus inferior races and survival of the fittest. And so starting in 1920s, when it's no longer okay to use biological theories, we start to see cultural stereotypes emerge of racial groups that are supposedly lazy and unintelligent versus racial groups that have work ethic and family values and so on. What's interesting when you think about race relations in the US is that you have to consider certainly the black-white binary, that is a product of slavery, Jim Crow, and later on mass incarceration. But you also have to consider immigration, right? And we'll discuss in our class that there was a hierarchy within the Caucasian races where Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Slavs, Jews, etc. were seen as inferior to Anglo-Saxon and Nordic races. And that hierarchy, in fact, collapses after World War II. We have been an anti-immigrant nation throughout. In fact, from 1924 to 1965, we barely have any immigration because of successful exclusion leagues. And then in 1965, we open up immigration, and this time we do get immigrants of color from South America, Asia, Africa, and so on. So throughout, as we discuss race relations, we'll be talking about the black-white binary and where immigrants that may be Latinx or Asian Americans find themselves on that color line. Now, really important ideas that we need to get on the same page about. And this is why I start by assigning the film Race the Power of an Illusion. And this is that even though race is an illusion, it's a biological myth. Geneticists will tell you there is no genetic basis to race. However, racism is very real in its consequences. It determines how much wealth you will have, where you're going to live, what kind of job you're going to get, and so on and so forth. We live in a highly racialized society. The other thing I want us to grasp from Tatum is that racism is a system of advantage and disadvantage. We need to rescue the idea of racism, the concept of racism, from becoming reduced simply to an interpersonal slur. Right? So to preserve the conceptual value of racism, we need to understand that it's a system. And finally, the most hopeful part of our class is to think about race as a social construct, which means if there's nothing inherent about race, it means that we can change racism at both individual and institutional levels. But very important to be able to bring that change is to think about racism as systemic and how it manifests in so many different ways, what we call the 4 I's. It's not only at that macro ideological level where we have all our institutions shaped by white supremacy. We all have cultural stereotypes that are sometimes even subconscious. Internalized racism that's experienced by people of color who feel a constant sense of inferiority and imposter syndrome. Interpersonal racism that is experienced through microaggressions as well as macroaggressions. And then finally, institutionalized racism that we see in our institutions like education, housing, health, and so on and so forth. So of course in our class we are going to focus on all of those different manifestations, but I do want to acknowledge that we are living in a historic moment of racial uprising. Many would say this explosion has happened in reaction to seeing a human being murdered for almost 9 minutes by law enforcement, so by an officer while 2 others watched. But many folks who have been living this reality as well as studying this for a long time will tell you that there hasn't been a single moment in our history when Black folks have not experienced violence of this nature. So unfortunately this happens too often, and has been happening right from the foundational moments of our nation. So I think that's a very key idea to understand, because we want to challenge arguments about a few bad apples, few racist cops who can be simply weeded out. This is systemic, and it has been happening right from the beginning and will continue unless we acknowledge that it is systemic. And the other part of our class that I really want to emphasize is also clarifying the term BIPOC, which is Black Indigenous People of Color. Many folks are probably encountering this online. And this is to, again, acknowledge that we will not move forward without solidarity. You will see incidents of hate happen on our campus, for instance. That's the image from the poster. This happened on our DVC campus. The Patriot Front is attacking college campuses nationwide. We do see an upsurge in white supremacist groups, hate groups. So we have to be ready to combat that through our solidarity and by acknowledging racism.